to be welcomed by somebody who needs no introduction. The website for the purposes of this conversation is factcheckzuck.com. Headline here out of Fox News: Candace Owens targets Facebook third-party fact-checkers with lawsuit. She says, "I decided I was not going to give up and sit down." She is a New York Times best-selling author of the book Blackout, which has just been released recently. Of course, founder of the Blexit movement as well. We'll talk about that later on in the show. Candace, welcome back.
It's good to be back. PJW, first person who ever had me on his show, ever.
It's good to see you again, Candace. Now, I want to get into this, you fighting the fact checkers, because this is something that's happened relatively recently. It's kind of flown under the radar, what with all the election news. You're basically saying it's time to fact check the fact checkers. I want to go on and talk about this development with PolitiFact having to publicly back down. But first, you're taking legal action against USA Today and this group called Lead Stories Fact Checker. Just tell us what prompted this initial lawsuit in the first place.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting story. And basically, I had published an article onto my Facebook page that was written by a guy named Dr. John Lee, who writes for The Spectator. And it was basically him, he's a former NHS pathologist, very strong resume, is a doctor, and can, of course, write his opinion on the COVID-19 sort of scare tactics that we see. And in the article, he basically just did a deep dive on how they were calculating COVID-19 deaths to expose, just sort of the fraudulence behind it. And people were dying, and they were doing post-mortem testing for this virus, which they had never done before, which, of course, was fluffing the numbers. And I published this onto my Facebook page, and it got fact-checked, and it got removed by Lead Stories LLC. So I look into Lead Stories LLC, and lo and behold, it turns out that a CNN editor of 26 years in 2015 decided to leave CNN and start Lead Stories LLC, and somehow scored one of the biggest contracts ever with Facebook to become a legal fact checker. His name is Alan Duke. And as soon as I saw this, I went, this is crazy. And I went through the proper means. I contacted Facebook and said, I want this removed from my account. What I said was not false. And he basically wrote an article declaring it was false because he had found another doctor that disagreed. So basically, this was a game of my doctor is better than your doctor, but I'm Lead Stories and I work for Facebook, so I'm going to be able to censor you. And that's pointedly ridiculous. And so I contacted Lead Stories and contacted Facebook and went through the means of their process where you're allowed to say, okay, well, you can appeal it. And of course, he came back and was basically like, I'm a god, and I've decided that this is still false, but I'll remove it from false to kind of false. And I just wasn't happy with that. So I decided, you know what, let's put these guys through discovery. Said to my husband, I want to go after them. I want to sue them, and I want to expose who exactly these fact checkers are, and just really understand how they got these contracts, how they got this contract with Facebook. And Facebook immediately distanced themselves from the fact checkers. They wrote my lawyer back a letter and was like, we have nothing to do with these third-party fact checkers. Great. Okay, so if you're saying now that we can just go after the fact checkers one by one and sue them, I'm happy to do that as well. So because he didn't change the false rating, we went after USA Today for another scenario that was similar to that one, which made no sense. It was basically an opinion check. And we hired Todd McMurtry, who represented the Covington Catholic Nick Sandman with some great success. And we are going after the fact checkers, plain and simple.
Now, to make it clear, you've got 4 million followers on Facebook. They demonetized your entire account after this initial fact-checked post. Did you get remonetized, or is it still demonetized? Because we have to make people understand here, according to the Washington Times report, because of your contract with Facebook, which they agreed to, you make around $1 million a month off of your Facebook account. By means of this fact check, it got demonetized. Of course, we know along with that, your entire account gets relegated in the algorithm. They're interfering with your book sales. You've got a new book out. That's again being relegated in the algorithm, people seeing that because of this parasitical fact-checking company, which is not just trying to demean you in terms of your reputation. They're literally stealing content and they're stealing revenue from your Facebook account because it was demonetized as a result of this, correct?
That's exactly right, because don't forget when they issue that false rating, they then direct traffic from your page to their site because they say this is why it's false. And usually what they put up is completely not even addressing what you initially put up. You know, they get around it and say something ridiculous where they go, well, this is false because this doctor, this is literally what they wrote on that post. This doctor in Colorado disagrees with Dr. John Lee in the UK. Therefore, we're going to say this is false. And you know, my average post, and this is without being monetized. This is with them shadow banning me. I'll usually get 3 million people looking at each of my Facebook posts. So that directs 3 million people to their site where they have advertisement and they earn money. I mean, it's completely parasitic behavior. And they do this just because they decided they're the fact check gods. And what we really know is that they're not actually checking facts. They're checking against what they deem to be wrongthink, right? And wrongthink is anything that goes against the preferred leftist mainstream narrative. And I mean, you could write something like only women can have birth. Only women can give birth, and you can get fact checked and they can pull that down and they can say, well, we found this guy, John Doe, out in Utah who disagrees and says men can give birth. And that's enough for them to fact check you and demonetize your page. And to me, it's pointedly ridiculous, and I'm prepared to fight them because I have the platform and the means to do so.
And again, this isn't with the background, of course, you were placed on this hate agent list by Facebook. I think last year that came out, or even the year before, of course. I was banned entirely back in May 2019 because they called me a dangerous individual. Again, I'm still in the process of suing Facebook simply to get information out of them, what they hold on me, which in the UK is the law that you have to have access to that by law. They've delayed that for over a year, citing coronavirus most recently. But we also had, again, these dangerous persons being put on this list. Incredibly, a couple of weeks later, Facebook came out with a fatwa which said it's unacceptable to incite violence against anyone using their platform, except if the person is on their dangerous individuals list. Of course, I was on that list along with people like Laura Loomer, Milo Yiannopoulos, Alex Jones, and others, literally inciting people to organize and commit violence using their service by saying it was okay. And then you made the point earlier about, you know, you go after Facebook and they pass it off and say, oh, it's a third party. We have no relation to them. We're not responsible for their activities. Similar thing with Wikipedia. I don't know if you've found this, Candace, but you've probably been in battles with Wikipedia over the past 4 or 5 years. Recently, some bright spark, some leftist editor at Wikipedia decided to call me a political extremist. And now I'm forever defined as a political extremist. The source for that is, of course, biased far-left news outlets and Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook itself. So once you get defined as this hateful individual by Facebook, which, of course, is completely biased in its approach to all this, then that suddenly becomes a neutral source. Then that suddenly becomes used by Wikipedia editors. Oh, but you can't sue Wikipedia because that's not an organization, apparently. But then when you try and go and sue the editors, they get protected by Wikipedia if you go after them. So across the board, it's creating this miasma about not knowing who to go after legally, right?
Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Aqui é o tradutor. Eu tô passando para te avisar que eu tô numa campanha para conseguir pelo menos mais 9 apoiadores até o final do ano. Esse canal não é monetizado, então totalmente depende de você. Eu preciso muito do seu apoio para manter esse canal atualizado e vivo, né, no ar. Os links para apoiar esse nosso projeto estão na descrição desse vídeo e no comentário fixado. Então é muito fácil e muito simples de apoiar. É graças a essas pessoas incríveis que eu posso estar trazendo conteúdo para vocês. O Orly, a Sandra, a Majestade, o Thiago, o Antônio, o Arthur, o Carlo, a Érica, o Rubens, o Caio, o Flávio, o Gustavo Bunho, a Spanish Vaz, o Eduardo, a Renata, o João, o Leonardo, o Wesley e o grande Pablo. E é isso aí, pessoal. Não se esqueçam de deixar seu like, seu comentário e até mais. Fui! Grande abraço.